Once their army was in place, they would be victorious. Now they had to face the shocking truth that this hadn't happened. Prime Minister Meir sent an urgent request to the Americans, begging them to resupply the country. Under attack on two fronts, Israelis felt their country was about to be squeezed out of existence. It would need a bold change of strategy to save the day. The simple truth was that Israel did not have the strength to fight this war on two fronts at the same time. Eleazar had to concentrate his strength on one front before he tried to roll back his enemy on the other. In the Sinai, the Egyptians were separated from Israel by hundreds of miles of desert. But here on the Golan, the Syrians were perilously close to Israel's main villages and towns across the Jordan, just a few miles' drive away. The Golan had to be Eleazar's priority. So he ordered the army and the air force to put everything they had into throwing the Syrians back. Some tank units would attack halfway along the Golan to relieve the pressure on Nafah, the Israeli HQ on the heights. Other Israeli tanks had already been ordered to go up onto the southern Golan, where the Syrians were closest to Israel's heartland. Their commander had been told bluntly, "You are Israel's last hope." But one thing in their favor was that the Syrians had made an extraordinary decision to halt up on the high ground rather than press on towards the River Jordan. It gave the Israelis vital breathing room to cross the river and move up towards the Golan.
On the night of October the 8th, Israeli tanks stormed the Syrian positions. The fighting raged around the clock. The Soviets had given the Syrians their latest infrared night fighting equipment. The Israelis had nothing of the kind. And that meant, during the hours of darkness, the Syrians could identify the Israeli tanks and cause horrific casualties.
I scanned the area with my scope and picked up a pair of infrared lights coming directly at me. I took another look. The headlamps were still approaching. The Syrian was targeting in on us. "Driver, back up," I screamed. And the tank rocked back till we came to a stop.
But as day broke, the Israeli ground troops got some much-needed relief from their air force. Throughout the rest of the day, however, the Israelis fought desperately to hold the line. The Israelis knew that if they gave way here, their country faced a real threat of extinction. Losses mounted on both sides, but as the battle progressed, it became clear that despite some Syrian technological advantages, the Israeli tanks had thicker armor, and the Israeli crews could fire more quickly and more accurately than their Syrian counterparts.
After 4 days of combat, I wasn't particularly worried by the Syrian tanks. It was enough to locate them and to have them come out to meet us, and victory would be ours.
By the 10th of October, 4 days into the war, there was an astonishing turnaround. The Syrians were in full flight from here on the Golan. Israel's tanks chased them into Syria itself. And soon the Israelis were within shelling distance of the Syrian capital, Damascus, just 30 miles off that way. Syrian President Assad sent a message to President Sadat, urging the Egyptian leaders to do something to relieve the pressure on Syria. And now Sadat made a momentous decision. Down on the Suez Canal, Sadat ordered his men to thrust way beyond the strong defense line they had established on the east bank of the canal. Their objective? Strategic passes through these mountains. But to get there, they'd have to leave the safety of their SAM missile umbrella way behind them. It was a high-risk strategy, and Shazli was appalled by the decision. But Sadat was immovable. What followed would be one of the biggest tank battles in history.
"25 miles east of the canal, Israeli tank commanders were well dug in on high ground in good defensive positions. Across the open desert, they could see the sand being kicked up by hundreds of advancing Egyptian tanks. The Egyptians were totally exposed to withering Israeli fire. But over the following hours, the Egyptian tank brigades repeatedly tried to push further east into the Sinai. As the Egyptians moved out beyond the protective cover of their SAMs, Israeli aircraft rained down bombs on the exposed Egyptian tanks. The Israelis' skillful use of their tank guns meant that they pulverized the Egyptians exposed down on the open ground. The Israelis knocked out an estimated 260 Egyptian tanks. They lost only 20 of their own.
Yeah, we fought hard. It was a successful tackle. And what made it possible was the fighting spirit of our soldiers. This battle was a turning point in the war.
Now the war started to swing in Israel's favor. By October the 15th, the Americans had responded to Prime Minister Mayer's request for resupplies. For days, American planes arrived in Israel with huge numbers of tanks, shells, and new planes. Israel was in a much stronger position. Elazar and his commanders were determined to force the Egyptians back across the canal. They now planned an exceedingly ambitious and risky operation, and a man who would play a key part in it was General Ariel Sharon. Sharon would later become Israel's prime minister, but in '73 he was one of the country's most dynamic generals and immensely charismatic. He just left the army that summer, but when war broke out, he was recalled. His detailed knowledge of the Sinai, where he'd fought during the Six-Day War, would prove invaluable in framing Israel's audacious new plan. The Egyptians on the east bank of the canal were split into two armies, one in the north and one in the south. 100,000 men and about 1,000 tanks, well dug in and well defended by minefields. They looked impregnable. But one of Sharon's patrols had discovered a narrow gap, just 1 mile wide, between the two armies at this spot, where the Suez Canal joined a large salt lake. Sharon was ordered to push through here with his tanks, widen the gap, and secure a corridor through to the canal. The Israelis would bridge the canal, and hundreds of tanks would then pour across it and fan out north and south to cut off the Egyptians from behind. The Egyptians' positions on the eastern canal bank would then be untenable. For the Israelis, the whole operation would be fraught with danger. The biggest threat was an Egyptian stronghold here, called Chinese Farm. It was just north of the planned Israeli corridor. Sharon had to neutralize the Egyptians at Chinese Farm if the Israeli plan was to succeed.
But what the Israelis didn't know was just how big the Egyptian presence was at Chinese Farm. Large numbers of Egyptian tanks and infantry were gathered there. Unaware of how outnumbered they were, at dusk on October the 15th, the Israeli assault force moved in. Sharon's tank crews approached Chinese Farm to make their surprise attack. They moved in from 3 different directions, but the Egyptian position was a lot stronger than the Israelis had expected. A ferocious night battle erupted between the Israelis and the Egyptians. Both sides now faced the same problem. The fighting was at such close quarters that it was difficult to tell who was friend and who was foe.
At one point, when my tank had stopped, an Egyptian soldier climbed onto it and asked me in Arabic for a cigarette. He thought we were Egyptians. I bent down and pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it at him.
All night, the Egyptians put up a stiff defense. They disabled Israeli tanks and killed and wounded enemy soldiers. The Israelis realized they faced a tough fight to secure the vital road to the canal.
The Egyptians were spread out like a horseshoe. They could shoot at us from three sides. It was a carpet of fire, the bullets were everywhere. I thought from here, we are not going to get out alive. This is our death place.